And welcome back to our last class. Pay no attention to the fact that I'm wearing the same shirt. I'm definitely not recording this on the same day as the previous class. For sure, it's a coincidence. And we come to the Holocaust. And really, it's sort of uncomfortable to end the course on the Holocaust. The Holocaust is not the end of East European Jewish history in a sense, but it does end the East European era of Jewish history with which we began our survey. Galicia, in particular, Eastern Europe in general, it's going to live on. I mean, there are going to be Jews living in Eastern Europe, for example. 250,000 Jews survive or return to Poland. Not so much the native Galicians, they're mostly decimated, but about 250,000 or more Jews return to Poland, and they're going to stay there for quite a few years. Romania, Hungary, some other countries still have Jewish communities, active Jewish communities to this day, and of course, Soviet Jewry survives the post-war period. And above all, that era survives in the emigre communities. Jews were moving out of Eastern Europe for decades, including, by the way, Galicians more so than Russian Jews, and they live on, especially in the U.S. and Israel. But it is the end of the era of Eastern European Jewry in many ways. And it's symbolized typically by this assembly line killing of the death camps, obviously unprecedented and completely innovative. But as we go through the story of Eastern Europe, keep in mind that this method of murder was applied only to about half of the 6 million Jewish victims. The other half died of starvation and disease, or more likely murdered by bullet or something more primitive, by murderers who saw their victims face to face. All 6 death camps were located in Poland, with the exception of much of Polish Jewry itself, though the death camp experience was really more common for Western and Central European Jews. Most East European Jews were murdered in the latter, more brutal face-to-face manner. It was not a uniform event. It was experienced differently in different countries, and even within some countries. Nazi policy differed from country to country. Local non-Jews reacted differently from country to country, and the Jews themselves reacted differently. And this usual Holocaust paradigm, the highly sophisticated modern bureaucracy channeled to produce mass murder, doesn't work as well in Eastern Europe as it does in Western Europe. Also keep in mind that Nazi policy itself, Nazi anti-Jewish policy, is going to evolve from 1933 over a fairly long period of time. The Nazis themselves in 1933 don't know what they wanted. They wanted the Jews out. That's about, they knew they would de-emancipate the Jews. They didn't know much more than that. And as persecution intensified, Jews early on had years to leave, to escape. They could escape to Palestine until 1936, for example, and others managed to escape elsewhere. It's one of the reasons why German Jews had one of the lowest murder rates of all of Europe. 20% of German Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. 80% survived, and that's partly because the Nazis were playing around with their policy, trying to figure it out. As always, I have an overview for where we're going with the class. We're going to start by looking at the evolution of Nazi policy with the beginning of the war in 1939, and above all, that means the ghettos in Poland. And then we'll talk about the final solution itself in the 2 main stages, the Einsatzgruppen, these mobile killing squads, and the death camps. And then we'll switch and look at the Soviet Jewish experience, especially the new Soviet territories occupied in 1939, and that means, above all for us, Galicia. And then the Holocaust itself in the Soviet Union beginning in 1941, and the reaction of the local population and of the Jews themselves. That's the general direction we're heading for the next hour or so. And as with some of our other classes, 2 or 3 other ones, here in the lecture we're going to have a general framework. The reading assigned for today brings the Galician story to the forefront, particularly the Ukrainian Jewish story, the East Galician story, both during the destruction itself and then in the second article, the aftermath of that destruction. You'll note on the syllabus that I recommend the book Neighbors, and I'll come back to that book later on, explain what it is. So let's start with the development of the policy of mass murder from 1939 to 1941. So they're moving now. In the 1930s, the Nazis had a policy of segregation and eventually forced emigration. And they moved during this time, sometime between 1939 and late 1941, they moved to a decision of mass murder. And that decision, this period, is exactly the focus of many historians trying to figure out how and why that happened. Let's begin with the breakout of the war in 1939. The Nazis have rapid success, as you know, and the dimensions of the Jewish question is going to expand dramatically. In 1933, there are 500,000 Jews in Germany. In 1938, 200,000 are added from Austria. In September of 1939, 2 million Jews are added to Nazi control. we're leaving out, remember, the Soviets take half of that territory, added to the Nazi piece of Poland, 2 million additional Jews. And Nazi policy is going to evolve, and evolution is really the best term. Nazi policy is going to evolve as the number of Jews in the Reich increases. There's going to be a steady radicalization of Nazi policy, and the conditions of control are going to change. In 1939, there are new conditions of German occupation in Poland. There's going to be, of course, a lot of random violence, murder and rape and so on. SS troops at the forefront of this, although the army is very much implicated as well. The point of the occupation was supposed to create so-called Lebensraum, right, living space for German expansion. This means massive population transfers throughout the German zone of Poland. It means creating a slave population, ultimately depriving that population of its intelligentsia and its natural leaders. And for the Jews, it's going to mean ghettoization. This is going to take a little bit of time to develop. First, Jews will be concentrated near railheads to transfer them for some kind of emigration. Maybe people talked about Madagascar, other possibilities, out east, that kind of thing. There'll be hundreds of ghettos by 1941 throughout Eastern Europe. And this, beginning with the concentration near railheads, it'll lead to ghettoization, eventually the walling off, the sealing off of the Jews. That takes time a little bit later. Forced labor gangs, then labor camps, first for the so-called Himmler Wall, like this anti-Soviet defense, and eventually for the armaments industry and other industries as well. And these urban ghettos are set up eventually, quite quickly actually, with the population used for forced labor. For example, the Łódź Ghetto, one of the most famous ones. The expropriation of labor reaches its height in these ghettos. The entire population put to work in industry with starvation rations. And, labor expropriation with these rations goes along with mass death by starvation and disease, especially typhus, a very slow destruction. And this situation in Eastern Europe is far, far different than what's going on in Germany or the West. Jews in Germany and the West are not experiencing any of this sort of attack yet. And the purpose of the ghettoization is somewhat contentious. There's an older so-called intentionalist line, the line that the Nazis and Hitler in particular knew all along that they were going to get to the final solution, and they're just going there in stages. And for them, this was just a step towards separation, separating the Jews out, winnowing down the population through starvation and disease to begin the moving towards mass murder. But the Nazis may have actually intended ghettoization as an interim step towards the solving of the Jewish problem through mass expulsion, either to the east or to Madagascar. Only when the general plans of racially reconstructing Eastern Europe bogged down in 41 and 42, and the disease and starvation really begin to spread, suddenly that became less realistic. So goes this argument. Appalled by the starvation and disease, this argument says Nazis would rationalize mass murder as some kind of humane solution. Because remember, emigration was the overall policy of the Nazi state until late 1940. Until 1940, it was not only legal for Jews to leave Nazi-controlled areas, it was actually the policy of the government. The truth is going to be in between these two views. On the one hand, the intentionalists are not quite right. It was not a conscious preparatory step towards mass murder, and did not have the set task of decimating the Jewish population. On the other hand, what's called the functionalist view, this notion that it's just increasingly radicalized of its own inertia, that's also not true, because we know that there are local initiatives running the ghettos who are attempting to normalize them, to make them productive and self-sustaining. In other words, there was some kind of central decision sent down to them when they were trying to normalize the ghetto, saying, no, that's not what's going to happen. I'm talking about 41 now. That's not what's going to happen. So the truth is somehow in between. The ghettoization is part of the vast demographic reorganization envisioned by the Nazis in Eastern Europe. Jews have to be concentrated in preparation for some kind of ultimate expulsion, but no specific policies were laid down for ghetto Jews at first. The sealed ghettos of prolonged duration weren't part of any policy imposed by Berlin at first. Local authorities assumed that they're going to be deported eastward or somewhere very soon. The famous sealing of the ghettos wasn't directed from Berlin. It resulted from a failure of Berlin to deport the Jews as quickly as they expected. The Łódź Ghetto was only sealed in April of 1940. The Warsaw Ghetto was only sealed in November of 1940. These are the two largest and most famous, but there are many, many, many others. And once sealed, the ghetto can no longer sustain itself through normal commercial means. And both presented the same problem in the mid-1940s. they're not supposed to be there anymore. What are the authorities supposed to do with them? And there were two ways of going for the local Nazi authorities, the attritionists versus the productionists. The attritionists argued, winnow them down, let them die off, let it work itself out. And then you had productionists who said, no, we should have a policy to mitigate the disaster and exploit Jewish labor as slave labor. In 1940, the former had the upper hand, the attritionists, but in the spring of 41, the latter seemed to prevail. Mass starvation was somewhat mitigated. The ghetto wasn't going to be starved to death, but it was going to be made into a productive entity. And to be sure, the Łódź ghetto had 40,000 working Jews by the summer of 41 and 80,000 there in the spring of 43. 80,000 still in the spring of 43. We'll come back to that ghetto later. Warsaw had much less success in creating a ghetto economy, and they had also experienced 6 months of deliberate starvation before that spring that was leading to 3 and later 5,000, 6,000 deaths per month. Just an insane reality, obviously. The productivity solution was difficult to achieve in the face of massive shortages and disease, the low priority of the ghettos, which were, after all, still supposed to be temporary. The ongoing horror and attrition at this point was not deliberate by cynical ghetto managers. It was a problem they couldn't overcome. And I'm not trying to exonerate them, God forbid, from what they were doing. They created this problem. They created the ghettoization. But once they created it, this was a result that they had to cope with. And the question was only that we have to ask is, were they intended to destroy the Jews through starvation, or did this develop on its own? And ultimately, the Jews were supposed to be given minimum prison rations, but this rarely happened. They typically had far, far less. And the ghettoized Jews are continued to starve to death, albeit maybe slower than the attritionists wanted. And the tragic irony is that when the Warsaw and the other ghettos began to be liquidated in the spring of 42, Warsaw Jews who survived till then were mostly gassed at the death camp of Treblinka. It was just when they were beginning to get productive, just when labor shortages and military need was at its height. The fact that the ghetto managers turned so quickly into managers of deportation and total mass murder doesn't mean that they always intended this. It's rather a result of their receptivity on their part of these bureaucrats to new policies coming from Berlin. Ultimately, about 500,000 Polish Jews died in the ghetto due to these conditions. About 10% of all the victims of the Holocaust and a sixth of all of Polish Jewry who died in the Holocaust. Not all of starvation. Tens of thousands died in the process of liquidation, inside or outside the ghetto, and so on. But again, this argues against this modernist paradigm. As important as that is, this argument that the Holocaust is a product of modernity, a product of industrialization, and bureaucracy without any kind of conscience behind it. But there's other things going on. Before we turn to the final solution, I also want to talk about the life in the ghetto for just a moment. The incredible diversity of life that the Jews produced, cultural institutions, libraries, schools, police, informers, underground activities, Jewish political authorities, famously the historian Ringelblum gathering up everything he could for the Oneg Shabbos archive, later discovered, which is how we know so much about ghetto life. Continuing religious development, famously the Eish Kodesh, the Holy Fire, Rabbi Shapiro, this great Hasidic Rebbe, was producing new homilies, which were also buried and later discovered. I point this out because of the issue of resistance. There was a discourse, especially in the few decades after the Holocaust, and especially here in Israel, that Jews didn't resist, and they glamorize above all else the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and you see a picture of that on your screen now. And that's important. There's no question that's important. That's the reason, by the way, Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, is set the day it is. It's set to coincide with the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, but further research and expanded ideas of what resistance means. I mean, you have a library system going on. Recall the picture you just saw a minute ago where people are walking past dead children on the street. And there's a library system in underground schools, and the library system has a fine if you return a book late. There's an insane world, a bizarro world going on around them, and they're creating libraries and schools and more to try to normalize it as much as possible. I think we want to keep that in mind when we talk about Jewish resistance, that it's much more, as important as armed resistance is, and we'll come back to it again, to keep in mind that broader picture. I also want to mention one other thing before we leave the ghettos behind, which is the so-called Judenrat, these Jewish councils that are used by the Nazis to govern the ghettos and ultimately to liquidate the ghettos. They're quite quite controversial in many ways. The scholarship today suggests that some of them abused their position, but for the most part, they really genuinely tried to mitigate the catastrophe as best they could. And there's one man in particular I want to point out to you. The head of the Łódź Judenrat, his name is Rumkowski. He cooperated with the Nazis until the end, until the very, very end of 44. In August of 44, he finally died with the survivors of the ghetto in the last liquidation. In early 44, they asked him to round up all children 10 years old and younger. And he negotiated with the Nazis, and he said, in the end, they said, okay, how about all children 8 years old and younger? And he did it. He rounded them up and turned them over to be murdered. And he's reviled, of course, as a traitor of some kind. But I want to point out that in July of 1944, there was an assassination attempt against Adolf Hitler, which really almost worked. If you know the story, that there was a bomb that would have killed him, but in the last moment it was moved behind a heavy desk, which absorbed the blast, and he survived. If that had worked, if that assassination had worked, there was simply no question, or almost no question, that the Holocaust would have ended the next day, and those who killed him would have sued for peace. And Rumkowski would be seen as the hero who saved every 9- and 10-year-old of the Łódź ghetto. He didn't know when the Holocaust would end. Nobody knew. The Soviets were pretty close to liberating the camp as well. Nobody knew when the Soviets would come. Nobody knew when the war would end. And the same man who's reviled as a traitor could be seen instead as somebody who saved these kids, trying to buy time for whoever he could. I just want to raise the issue. There's no moral certainties here. It's a complicated question. In 41, the decision was made to engage in mass murder at the same time, more or less, as the decision to invade the USSR. And that's not a coincidence. The decision for the final solution was intimately connected with the invasion of the Soviet Union. The idea was to uproot and destroy Bolshevism, which is connected to the destruction of the Jews. The Jews are viewed almost mystically as the biological embodiment, or maybe the root of Bolshevism. And this was conceived as a total war. Only one could survive, the Aryan race or Judeo-Bolshevism, a decisive struggle with apocalyptic overtones, because Bolshevism is equated to this Jewish conspiracy. It's also an unparalleled opportunity to eliminate the Jews because of the war itself. War means secrecy, or at least pseudo-secrecy. Total war means a subterfuge of violence. All Soviet citizens were considered subhuman. All the leaders would be eliminated. The entire USSR would be enslaved. Millions of Soviet POWs, by the way, were murdered, mostly starved to death in this campaign, others shot or gassed. The decision was also connected to the ultimate achievement of Lebensraum, of the restructuring of Eastern Europe. But when and why? There's no written evidence for mass murder, and I doubt it'll ever be found. It's not surprising because of the nature of the Nazi regime. But the fact that Hitler was behind the decision, no serious historian really doubts. As late as October of 1940, Jews were still being shipped away for emigration. In other words, emigration as national policy and solution was still in effect. But sometime between October of 1940 and the summer, or maybe a bit later of 41, the decision for the final solution was made, and not just for the Soviet Union, for all of Europe. And this was later confirmed in the famous conference at the Wannsee Resort in January of 42, in which the heads of the departments were informed of the plan, and considerable progress to date. I want to point out, though, there's a common misconception that the decision was made at that conference. We know a lot about it. There's a museum there today. There's been movies made. It was a 90-minute meeting followed by a brunch, as the invitation said. And it's a famous conference. And if you ever go to Germany, to Berlin, you should visit the Wannsee Museum. But that was when they informed the heads of departments of the decision. The decision for the final solution was already made at that point. And in fact, there had already been a fair amount of progress in that direction. It was rather made, the decision was rather made sometime during the summer euphoria of 1941, either connected with the euphoric success of the invasion or else planned as a part of it. And we know this for a few reasons. For example, there's no evidence for a mass exodus to the east in the summer of moving Jews out. Evidence suggests actually Hitler had given the okay by the time of Barbarossa itself for the mass murder of Jews. The euphoria of victory led Hitler to decide to expand Soviet Jewish genocide to all of Europe. There is some evidence that suggests local initiatives of mass murder by Nazis, who also encouraged locals quite successfully that's also a possible origin, but certainly most historians place the decision sometime in the spring or summer of 41. But how? The mechanism of mass murder. This develops over time and somewhat by trial and error. The first mechanism was the mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen. These are units of SS soldiers who move with the Wehrmacht into the front, killing as many Jews as possible. This involves total coordination, cooperation between the Wehrmacht and the SS. The army is completely implicated in the ready cooperation with the SS. And there's a mentality of efficiency that takes over once it becomes obvious that they're there to stay. The procedure was fairly standard. You round up the Jews in the town. You take Jews in groups to some secluded site. You have the men dig a mass grave, and then you gun them down. Some 500,000 Jews are murdered in the first sweep, which the SS saw as too inefficient and unthorough. 900,000 more in the second sweep going into 1942. They also had a minor purpose vis-a-vis POWs, officers and commissars of the Communist Party. They're also to be executed. And here's a general description of what happened. The Einsatzgruppen would enter a village or city and order the prominent Jewish citizens to call together all Jews for the purpose of resettlement. They were requested to hand over their valuables to the leaders of the unit and shortly before the execution to surrender their outer clothing. The men, women, and children were led to a place of execution, which in most cases was located next to a more deeply excavated anti-tank ditch. Then they were shot, kneeling or standing, and the corpses thrown into a ditch. We have a sense of the numbers because there's the reports, many of which have survived, telling us exactly how many were shot each day, how many men, women, children, and also commissars and so on along with them. Here's one description from the time from an auxiliary. The massacre had been carried out by German SS men and Lithuanian police. On return from the killing, one of the Lithuanians boasted, as a Jew, Alter Galperin later recalled, quote, that he had dragged small Jewish children by their hair, stabbing them with the edge of his bayonet and throwing them half alive into pits. The smallest children he just threw into the pit alive because to kill all of them first is too much work. And those auxiliary units are quite important. We'll come back to those as well. Who were the men in these Einsatzgruppen? Mostly professionals in their 30s, some older, civilians, not useful in the regular army, some auxiliaries from local population, all of them becoming efficient killers. And this is the subject of one of the most famous Holocaust books ever written by Chris Browning, Ordinary Men. And I want to just point out that this is a book that you should be reading. Essentially, he tries to understand the motivation of these killers and is based on various evidence from testimonies taken in the 1960s and other evidence. He suggests that it has a lot more to do with deference, with what Stanley Milgram was studying in that famous experiment in the 1960s, with deference to authority, and far less to do with anti-Semitism. So I really encourage you, I'll take a moment to encourage you to read that book and also to explore the Milgram experiment on which it's based. The video is available on YouTube. In any event, the Einsatzgruppen are deactivated in 1942, too costly to be continued, although quite successful. You can see here the numbers. Something like 3,000 men, not including their auxiliaries, kill 1.5 to 2 million Jews. In 42, the decision, I should say in 41, the decision to construct death camps equipped with poison gas facilities was made, sometime in October or so, by which time steps were already being taken to begin the construction of the first camp first camps in Belzec and Chelmno. Gassing involved trial and error. Actually, the Einsatzgruppen had gas vans using carbon monoxide, but this was very inefficient. The euthanasia program, the short-lived euthanasia program, which, by the way, was shut down because of popular protests. Popular protests shut down that program. The euthanasia program also used carbon monoxide. It was stopped, but the equipment and strategy was transferred. And Chelmno also tested mobile killing vans, but eventually they moved to the assembly line killing, a totally new innovation. In 42, 6 death camps are built. These are different than the concentration camps or the labor camps. 6 death camps. Auschwitz was the only one to use the hydrogen cyanide, Zyklon B, produced by industrial firms that are completely complicit in this whole process. The others are Majdanek, Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. And these are, again, using rational means. This is the paradigm that people talk about with the Holocaust. Rational means modeled on the assembly line of a factory, a form of mass production, the final product being not a Model T car, but death. In an intricate operation which involves specialists, engineers, and so on, sealed rail cars come into the camp, separated into workers, able-bodied, mostly men, and those who were gassed. The gas chamber involves dismantling, taking off the clothes, shaving hair, and the famous illusion of the showers. And then the dead bodies put on elevators hauled to crematoria or open pits. The laborers themselves, who are selected to work, are fed diets that keep them alive for 3 to 4 months at most, typically. And the mentality of the camp commanders was efficiency. Efficiency above all. The final solution here, using the modern state and all of its powers, bureaucratic and technological, to implement this policy of annihilation. You see here the image of the selection and of women and children being selected towards death. Here's an eyewitness account of how it worked. Outside, the men on night shift were handling a convoy of some 3,000 men, women, and children who had been led from their train into the hall 200 yards long and prominently labeled in various languages, baths and disinfecting room. Here they had been told to strip, supervised by the SS and the Sonderkommando. These are the Jews forced to do this work. They were then led into a second hall where the SS and the Sonderkommando left them. Meanwhile, vans painted with the insignia of the Red Cross had brought up supplies of Zyklon B crystals. The 3,000 were then sealed in and gassed. 20 minutes later, the patented mechanical ventilators were turned on to dispel the remaining fumes. Men of the Sonderkommando, wearing gas masks and rubber boots, entered the gas chamber. They found the naked bodies piled in a pyramid that revealed the last collective struggle of the dying to reach clean air near the ceiling. The weakest lay crushed at the bottom, while the strongest bestrode the rest at the top. The corpses were washed, disentangled, and dragged to the elevators, lowered to the crematorium, the gold teeth removed with pliers and thrown into buckets filled with acid, and the women's hair shaved from their heads. The desecrated dead were then loaded in batches of 3 on carts of sheet metal and fed automatically into one of 15 ovens. A single crematorium consumed 45 bodies every 20 minutes. The capacity of destruction in Auschwitz was little short of 200 bodies an hour. And rather than showing you images of the emaciated bodies and piles of shoes that you've seen a million times, some of you might not have seen the following images, which to me are the most disturbing I've ever seen of Auschwitz. They were discovered only a few years ago and donated to the Holocaust Museum. They're pictures of life in Auschwitz by those who worked there, and specifically life on their day off. This is the work that's being done 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And this is what the workers at Auschwitz looked like on their day off. Having a wonderful time lying in the sun, having a game and a picture with an accordion, and ice maybe, Christmas at Auschwitz. The commandant was known to love his dog. I've seen thousands or tens of thousands of photos from the Holocaust, but to me, actually, these photos are among the most disturbing. And you can see the rest of the series at the Holocaust Museum website in Washington, D.C. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about Jewish life in the Soviet zone from 1939 to 1941. First of all, recall the rise of Soviet anti-Semitism in the late 1930s, the purges and so on, culminating eventually in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. In other words, the pact dividing up Eastern Europe between Stalin and Hitler. This is going to worsen the situation for Soviet Jews in many ways. Jews who escaped to the USSR from Nazi Europe, even many of them were going to be returned to the Gestapo. There's also going to be a blackout on news of what's happening to the Jews in Nazi-occupied areas. That's very important because they don't know what's happening there. They are much less likely to attempt escape before it's too late. There's a general silence, in fact, in the Soviet Union about the Holocaust during the war itself and, frankly, for a half century thereafter about what happened to the Jews. And there's silence about anti-Semitism committed in Soviet-occupied East Central Europe, and discrimination against Jews in some areas, as we'll see. Less and less are materials being published about the Jewish national minority. And Soviet anti-Semitism is going to worsen during the war years for a variety of reasons. I mean, anti-Semitism always gets worse during times of crisis. Hard to imagine a crisis worse than World War II. And initial Soviet defeats are going to lead to the search for a scapegoat, and Jews might fit the bill, and particularly with the impact of Nazi propaganda, there's no wall against Nazi propaganda happening here. But in East Central Europe, we've already talked about the rise of anti-Semitism in the late 30s, these multinational territories with rampant anti-Semitism, and even some semi-fascist or outright fascist regimes annexed to the USSR. During the war years, deportations to the east continued. The sacking of Jewish cultural figures and so on. And this would greatly increase after the war, actually. Now, these cultural figures are mostly murdered. Michael, you might remember him, despite the fact that he was working tirelessly for the Jewish anti-fascist committee and trying to raise money for the Soviet Union and so on. He was murdered. Many other cultural figures were murdered, Yiddish writers, poets, and so on. But actually, a lot of the regular people who were deported to the East, actually, if they survived the deportation and survived wherever they were sent to, whether Siberia or elsewhere, they actually survived the war because of that, paradoxically. And we'll come back to that point a little later. Let's talk about just say a few words about the Jews living under the lesser of two evils, right? Once you have the invasion of Stalin and Hitler, for the Jews, it was the lesser of two evils quite clearly. They might not have known what was to come, but they knew that Stalin was better than Hitler. These annexed territories stretched from Finland to the Black Sea, containing about 2 million Jews, including most of Galicia, almost all of East Galicia. If you look at the map, you can see the city names there. The sudden arrival of the Red Army coincided with the Nazi expansion in Eastern Europe, and most Jews were relieved that they were spared the Nazi takeover. Unlike most non-Jews, by the way, most non-Jews, Ukrainians, for example, much preferred to have the Nazis versus Stalin come. For the Jews, it was clearly the lesser of two evils, but it was an evil in a sense nonetheless. The new regime quickly introduced a package of harsh measures designed to Sovietize the population. Now, the whole population, not just the Jews, but the Jews were most affected in some ways because of their unique economic, cultural, and religious circumstances. So first of all, the socio-economic conditions suffered. The Jewish role in commerce and industry and other aspects of the economy had been these aspects that were being suppressed by the Soviets had been far more significant than other population groups. Jewish enterprises are confiscated, private commerce mostly liquidated. The standard of living of most Jews obviously declined. Simple things like having to work on the Sabbath obviously was going to happen. The proportion of Jews among the hundreds of thousands of employer and merchant classes deported to the interior as enemies of the people was very high, not to mention Zionists and Bundist political activists. Some of these will be murdered, no question. Some will die of starvation disease, but the vast majority will survive, and they were ironically the ones who will survive the Holocaust. That's number one. Number two, Jewish national education, obviously going to be crushed, going to be replaced with Bolshevik Yiddish schools. Ditto for the cultural institutions. Jewish theater, oddly, manages to survive somewhat. YIVO continues to operate somewhat. In fact, there's even a chair of Yiddish studies established at the University of Vilna during this time. But most Jewish national institutions are going to be dissolved. Zionists and Bundists, as I said, arrested and expelled, some murdered. Jewish religion brutally suppressed, and so on. And again, Jews recognized that the alternative was far worse, and most tried to avoid conflict with the authorities and to restrain any urge to resist, because this was a preferred course for sure. I mean, generally speaking, Jews as individuals, if they're willing to play along, to assimilate, to renounce any outward manifestations of their Jewishness, can be accepted in the Soviet Union, even into the party and state ranks. Even after there's a Ukrainianization and Belarusification set in those areas, in order to, the regime was afraid that those populations would view the Bolsheviks as a Jewish regime, and so they attempted to Ukrainianize and Belarusify those regimes in those places. Jews were Jews were expelled, but they were at least able to keep lower echelon jobs. This failed, obviously. The Soviet effort failed. Most members of local nationalities continue to make the association between Jews and Bolshevism and hate the Jews as instruments of the Soviet regime. And this connection between Jews and this Bolshevik regime is a critical factor in either the active or passive support of the non-Jews in the Holocaust. Finally, it's worth noting the impact of 3 million now Soviet Jews, including Galician Jews, they're now Soviet Jews, re-encountering 2 million formerly Russian Jews with a strong Jewish identity, nationalist and or Orthodox. This short-lived encounter between these Jews who had remained national, remained religious, and so on in East Central Europe, re-encountering, even for just a few years, Russian Jewry, would have an impact decades beyond the war even, eventually being part of the national revival of Soviet Jews in the 1960s and 1970s. And of course, these 2 million new Jewish Soviet citizens were impressed by the discovery of important Soviet officers, artists, and functionaries who spoke Yiddish. It was a two-way revelation. What's the legacy of these 2 years in terms of the Holocaust? So I'll point out a few things. First of all, economic aspects. The expropriation of Jewish property under the Soviets obviously weakened their Jews' ability to resist when the Holocaust would begin. On the other hand, many Jews managed to learn a trade that might save their lives during the Holocaust, and others engaged in physical labor that might have strengthened their ability to survive during the Holocaust. Social aspects. Soviet period accelerates the disintegration of Jewish society and family unit. It makes it easier for young members to leave their families and escape to the east in the summer of 1941. Jews are admitted into the ranks of the civil service. They're integrated into other work areas, learned Soviet social habits. They were somewhat more able to hide their identities if they chose to do this, to try to do this. And in fact, many were permitted to visit the Soviet interior, and those who happened to be there in June of 41 were similarly saved from the Holocaust. On the other hand, the Soviets had restricted information about Nazi persecutions of Jews as a result of the treaty between them in 1939, and so many Jews chose not to flee the invading German armies when they might have attempted it. Political aspects, Jewish acceptance into the party and state apparatus, especially the military and the police, contributed greatly to the deterioration of relations between Jews and local non-Jews, leading to the tragic consequence of pogroms, collaboration, and passive support for the Holocaust in the Nazi period. Lithuanians and Ukrainians were murdering, and even in some cases Poles, were murdering Jews before the arrival of the Nazis, and on their own initiative after the Nazis arrived. On the other hand, service and defense formations gave many Jews critical military experience that affected their ability to fight under Nazi occupation. You see what I'm getting at? Each of these experiences of the Soviet period, it might have hurt some Jews, other Jews it might have made a difference to save them. Cultural aspects. Besides older Jews born during the Tsarist period, many younger Jews learned Russian during these 2 years, bolstering their ability to survive in the Russian interior as refugees if they attempted it. Religiously, the breakdown of religious observance under the Soviets might have eased the willingness of Jews to save themselves in this way under the Nazi period. And finally, ideological aspects. Zionists, Bundists, and many others were forced to go underground during the Soviet 2 years, and this facilitated their actions under the Nazis, especially partisans, but also ghetto fighters and other examples. There's really little scholarship on this until quite recently, because the Soviets consistently denied any uniquely Jewish aspect of Nazi persecution of Soviet citizens. Only recently, when the archives were opened, so a great deal more has been learned. And I'd like to talk about the Soviet experience for just a little bit, and particularly 3 issues. Number one, the genocide itself in the Soviet Union. Second of all, the reaction of the local population. And third of all, Jewish resistance. And in each of those areas, I'll refer back to the general context of the whole of Eastern Europe, but I want to speak about the Soviet experience in particular. First of all, genocide. As I mentioned, the decision for the final solution was strongly connected with the invasion of the Soviet Union. The idea was to uproot and destroy Bolshevism, which is connected to the destruction of the Jews. They are mystically somehow the biological embodiment of Bolshevism. This is a total war. Only one could survive, the Aryan race or the Jewish. And as Chris Browning put it in one of his books, when the Nazis invaded Poland in September of 1939, the fate of Polish Jews could wait, but the fate of Polish intelligentsia could not wait. The Einsatzgruppen set themselves to killing any carrier of Polish national identity right away, even before the Holocaust itself set in. As the Nazis prepared to confront Bolshevism in 1941, neither the Russian commissars nor the Russian Jews could wait. Both would have to be eliminated by the onrushing Einsatzgruppen, for ultimately they were the political and biological manifestations of the same Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. And this decision was part of the invasion, famously sealed at Wannsee. By the time Wannsee happened, almost 1.5 million Soviet Jews had been killed before any of the death camps were in operation. In other words, the Soviet Jews experienced a different method and speed of destruction than Jews in Western Europe, and even the Jews in East Central Europe, Poland and West Ukraine, meaning Galicia. Those Jews, Polish and Galician, were not yet viewed as heavily Bolshevized because they'd only spent 2 years under the Soviet rule. So at first, only about 25 or 35% of West Ukrainian Jews were murdered. Most were killed instead in the summer and fall of 1942. The Galician Jews were mostly killed at the Belzec death camp. Not that they weren't ultimately decimated as well. Of the 870,000 Jews in Western Ukraine in June of 1941, about 17,000 will survive in 1944. That's 2%, if my math is correct, 2%. Nazi authorities saw a particular urgency in exterminating Jews within the pre-39 borders of the Soviet Union. They were generally liquidated immediately after conquest in late 41 or at the latest early 42. The Jews in the Polish ghettos mostly murdered later in 42 or even beyond. And it was accomplished mostly through the Einsatzgruppen, although they were aided by regular army units and police units and local population and so on. The procedure was repeated many times. Following the occupation of a city, the Nazis appointed an elder or a group of elders to be in charge, like the Judenrat, but not exactly. In the Soviet Union, it was different. The Judenrat was mostly pre-war leaders of the Kehila and other Jewish bodies, but there were no such organizations in the Soviet Union, so they would just pick a Jew who happened to know German. He had very few privileges, and generally he was murdered with the rest of the population quite quickly. The primary, often exclusive function was to compile a list of the Jewish population. This was pretty easy in the Soviet Union, because you might remember that in the 30s, in 1932, they were required to put their nationality on their passport. Nationality was indicated on Soviet identity cards. In any event, most Jews registered voluntarily, after which they had to wear that famous star patch for easy identification. In some cities, Jews were concentrated in certain neighborhoods, but without a fence or guards as in a ghetto. It was going to be lasting much shorter period of time. They didn't have time for that. Other times there was maybe a fence, or they were gathered in an abandoned factory as some kind of temporary concentration camp. It was just a preliminary, unlike the ghettos, this really was a preliminary step towards mass murder, which followed almost immediately, unlike in the ghetto. They tried to conceal their true intentions until the very last moment, telling Jews they'd be transferred to a workplace or something like this. They would be ordered to assemble with several days' provisions, but once they gathered as ordered, they'd be transported by foot or truck to near some area of forest near the town and simply murdered by gun. People saw their victims face to face. In the end, 1.5 million of the 2 million Jews occupied in 1939 were murdered, and the other 500,000 fled or were deported to the Soviet interior, which saved their lives. Of the original 3.3 million Soviet Jewish citizens, 1 million were murdered, and the rest, again, were fled or were deported to the interior. That access to the Soviet interior saved their lives if they survived. In contrast, 90% of Polish Jews were killed, including 98% of Galicians, 90% of Lithuanian Jewry, and so on. What about the local population? The story here is complicated. It's an emotionally charged issue, and it has pretty important political ramifications. I'll just mention one issue. I talked about the book Neighbors, which is on your syllabus as a recommended book, the famous story of the town Jedwabne, which for decades the sign said, here the Nazis killed all of these Jews, but then Jan Gross comes along and proves, no, in fact, it was the local Polish neighbors who killed their Jewish neighbors. It was not the Nazis who did it. In fact, the only 3 Jews or something who survived were the ones being held by the Gestapo. Everybody else was killed by the local population, and killed brutally, by the way, with very simplistic tools and for various different reasons. It's an important book. This is emotionally laden. Right now, happening in Poland, there is a reaction against this, an attempt to suppress this again because it's so emotionally charged. The images you see on your screen are from Lviv in 1941, and you'll see that these are Ukrainians involved in the pogrom in Lviv in July 41. Ukrainians. And they are certainly being stoked by the Nazis and enabled, above all, enabled by the Nazis. But they're the ones who are doing it. And by the way, the half-naked woman, there's a lot, if you Google search the images from the Lviv pogrom of 41, there's a lot of that kind of humiliation going on as part of the murder, as part of the pogrom. The police and Nazi auxiliary units are drafted from the local population who actively take part in the slaughter of the Jews, all classes, not just the fringes of society. And their cruelty measured up to the Nazis and sometimes surpassed them. They are especially effective in hunting down Jews hiding during the mass killing operations because they can identify Jews more easily than the Germans. There's a whole chapter in Chris Browning's book about the Jew hunts they would go on, and they would use the local Poles to find them. And varied reasons people did things. It might be money, it could be sympathy with the Nazi regime, it could be hatred of the Soviet government, sometimes nationalism, it could be religious, lots of different motivations. And many of them, especially, might have been exacting revenge on the Soviets through the murder of Jews. In Lviv, for example, they dragged out of the prison. The Soviets had murdered some 1,000 or 2,000 local Ukrainians just before they left, had been arrested. And the pogrom was felt by many people to be a revenge attack because the Jews who were left in Lviv, after all, were no different than the Soviets who had already withdrawn. this was especially true of the Ukrainians. And again, they're engaging in pogroms almost immediately following the withdrawal of the Soviets, but also the Lithuanians to an extent as well. The reality of 39-41 is that the Jews suffered at the expense of a concerted policy of Ukrainianization, but that was not the image that they had. They had the Jews being in league with the Soviet regime. And there's also this sort of traditional anti-Semitism being fostered by Nazi ideology, being nurtured among them. It was a small percentage of the population in the end, but it doesn't take a lot. It was a small percentage of people, of Ukrainians and Lithuanians included, including certainly also of Poles. Another group of collaborators among the local population who might have were those who were sort of willing or even happy to turn in a Jew or turn in a non-Jew who was hiding them, which is a capital crime. It not only killed those individuals when they did this, but the fact that there were a few people willing to do it prevented many others who would have tried to help hide people, but they were afraid of being outed by that small number. Again, these informers were only a minority, but a powerful and influential one. Many might have looted Jewish property, although they weren't in any of the above categories. And there were some brave souls who risked their lives and risked their families' lives to save Jews for a variety of reasons. And here again, I'll recommend a film that explores this called Hiding and Seeking, about a guy who goes back to Poland to find the family that hid his father and his father's brother, and discovers it's very complicated why people do this. They had claimed they did it because they wanted to get money, and they were complaining they never got paid, but it was clear from the interviews, you don't risk your lives and your children's lives for 3 years or 2 years for money. It's a very interesting story. And there's lots of other ways that people could help. They could sneak food into a ghetto before it was walled in and so on. There were a lot of Christian institutions who hid thousands of Jewish children, but those are not available in Russia, right? They had been shut down between the wars. So you might have some Ukrainian priests, for example, supporting the pogroms, and you have others, though, who oppose them and would hide the Jews in their own residences. Same with municipal leaders. They might be supporting the pogroms or might be trying to save the Jews. And almost everybody was in between. They won't actively inform on the Jews hiding, but if asked by a Nazi, they would turn them in. And certainly a broad strata of the population would never have participated in any of this, but were happy to see the Jews gone. It's a complicated story. The estrangement of Poles and Jews, or Ukrainians and Jews, both before and during the early years of the war, is the context of this. The article that's assigned to you, one of the 2 articles assigned to you for today, is about the history of that relationship and estrangement of Ukrainians and Jews in East Galicia, which is why I signed it. The Soviet Union had one interesting aspect that didn't appear elsewhere, which is namely 1/5 of the Jews had married out of the faith, a very high percentage in Eastern Europe. And these non-Jews rarely abandoned their Jewish spouses. Some even joined them in their fate. And non-Jewish in-laws reacted in different ways. Some turned in the relatives, others didn't. Latent animosities that would normally never surface, all come out when lives are at stake. But note that children of mixed marriages, unlike in Germany, where they had the category of Mischlinge, sort of these mixed breed people, in Eastern Europe, so if you're Slavic and Jewish, that you were destined to be murdered, which means if you were turning in your Jewish son-in-law or daughter-in-law and their children, you're killing your own grandchildren. So that was part of the story as well. And finally, Jewish resistance under occupation. There are 2 prime factors figuring in the Soviet Jews' response to these sort of inhumane conditions forced upon them after the rapid Nazi occupation of the Soviet Union. The short time span between the onset of the occupation until the killing, it could be just weeks or less, and the state of the Jewish population on the eve of the occupation. For Jews, as for everyone else, Nazi occupation was a complete surprise. They assumed the Soviet army could hold them back. The massive draft left most Jewish families, like others, without their men, which further stymied possibilities of escape. The rapid chain of events from occupation to obliteration seriously impeded attempts at escape or organized resistance. In towns with in towns with ghettos, they existed so briefly that it was impossible to form a resistance movement as happened in the Polish ghettos. There was a Jewish partisan, there were Jewish partisan groups. There was not an organization per se of all of them, but between 20 and 30,000 Jews fought in partisan movement, many and mostly or exclusively Jewish units. Non-Jewish units, it depended where. In the Balkans, they tended to accept Jews. In the Soviet Union, especially the Ukrainians, they might have been not only refusing to accept Jews, they might have been as willing to kill Jews as they were to kill Germans. The image on your upper right-hand corner is of Bandera. Bandera is the hero of Ukrainian partisan forces. That particular statue exists in a very larger-than-life statue in contemporary Lviv. And he was as willing to kill Jews as he was to kill Germans. And he is the hero of the Ukrainian nation. This is a very complicated story. I'll come back to it in our conclusion. There was some relief in partisan anti-Semitism after mid-1942, and especially in 43, because the Soviet military was parachuting men into occupied territory to take charge of the partisans, and that would have stopped that kind of attacks on Jews. But certainly only a Jewish partisan group would have permitted families to camp. That's a risk with no military value, and only Jewish women and children feared for their lives. So no other partisan group would have allowed it. Incidentally, Jews also participated in Soviet armed forces disproportionate to their numbers. Over 500,000 Jewish men out of a working-age male population of 750,000 fought in the Soviet army, but also they were disproportionate in their medals for bravery won and that kind of thing. Many of these heroes later murdered after the war by Stalin's anti-Semitic campaign. And there were obviously other forms of resistance, passive and active. Thousands hid or refused to report. Some attempted to acquire false papers. Others committed suicide rather than be murdered. Or Jews attempted to die with dignity, praying or spitting and cursing their murderers and so on. Again, we have to think of resistance in the biggest possible sense. To conclude on Soviet Union, 3 major characteristics typify the Holocaust in the pre-war borders of the USSR. Number 1, the murder of the Jews just a short time after the occupation. Number 2, their extermination in close proximity to their homes. And number 3, the absence of an organized Jewish public life because of 20 years of Soviet policy, which dictated the character of Jewish resistance to their attack against the backdrop of general apathy and hostility by the surrounding local population. To conclude, 3 types of murder annihilated most European Jews killed in the Holocaust. First of all, the ghettos, death, disease, overcrowding, and so on Polish soil mostly. Some died in the war itself, by the way, the bombardment of Warsaw, for example. Number 2, the Einsatzgruppen. And number 3, the concentration camps and the death camps, above all, symbolic of the Holocaust and their honing of the most modern technology and bureaucracy for this end. For Soviet Jews, and above all for Ukrainian Jews, it was far more the brutal Einsatzgruppen. For Polish and other East Central European Jews, death camps were vital, although the ghettos murdered some 500,000 Polish Jews alone. For Galicia, it's a combination. The picture you see on the bottom left corner is of Jews who in Drohobych who have survived the murderous spree of the Einsatzgruppen and are now being deported to Belzec. So it's a combination for the East Galician Jews. The smaller photo is the shooting of Jews at a wall in Drohobych in 1943. The Holocaust was not as mechanized as some people think. In Ukraine and White Russia and elsewhere in the Soviet Union, it was not mechanized. It was one-on-one, large-scale massacres, and even the weapons were sometimes less than modern. The sort of barbaric violence that happened at a place like Jedwabne that was described by Jan Gross and neighbors, it could have happened in 942 as easily as 1942. Second point, East Europeans were not the perpetrators, for the most part, of the Holocaust. The murder was perpetrated by another country on their soil. So we need to distinguish between how these nations are exonerating themselves in contemporary discourse, but also the more ambiguous reality. The actual behavior on the ground of local non-Jews was more complex, including a whole wide range of activities. Certainly, the dominant climate by the time the war breaks out is very hostile to Jews. But considering the risks that harboring Jews involve, you really have to marvel at those who attempt to save Jews as much as one wants to condemn those who participate in the murder. Most people obviously remained in the middle. And finally, A note about continuity of these Jews and of Galicia in particular. Their culture continues. The emigres take it with them, and so on. And the second article I assigned to you is by Omer Bartov, talking about the tragedy of the erased community in Galicia itself. You know, I was in Galicia recently, and I spoke to a college student from Kiev, but he's originally from the city of Stry, which is near Drohobych. On your screen there, you can see the synagogue of Stry as it appeared in its glory days, and the bottom left corner, how it appears now. It's just a shell with no roof. There's actually trees growing inside it. It's about to collapse. And I said to him, I've been to Stry. I was just there, and it's a lovely town. And he asked me, why were you in Stry? Why would you possibly, in other words, he's from this small town. He can't imagine why a Westerner would want to go there. And I said, well, it's beautiful, and also I study Jewish history, so I'm interested in Stry because I studied Jews. And he said, why would you go to Stry because you studied Jews? And I said, well, it used to be 35 or 40% Jewish. And he said, really? I have no idea. He had no idea that Jews, there are people he knows, old people who still knew Jews, and he had no idea. So in this sense, when Omer Bartov talks about the erased Jewish community, they're being erased. It's true. But still, things are changing. You know, you have on the one hand the statues of Bandera all over the place and celebrated as a Ukrainian hero. That's a complicated story. But on the other hand, just recently, the famous Golden Rose Synagogue in Lviv, in Lemberg, and today Lviv, a 500-year-old synagogue that was blown up by the Nazis. The city of Lviv and the country of Ukraine sponsored a very expensive, beautiful memorial to the Jews of Ukraine on the site of the Golden Rose Synagogue, sponsored by the state. It is not only erased. That world is gone, but you can visit the place, and it doesn't feel that different except for the Jews missing. So many of its markers, synagogues and cemeteries and more, still attest to its former vitality, and you can still tap into the culture by combining that on-site visit, feeling the place, which truly, outside of a couple exceptional cities that have been Sovietized, truly feels and looks the way it did 100 years ago. And by combining that, seeing the place, seeing some of the markers that are still there and being preserved and want to be preserved by the states, and you combine that with the culture which still exists in its literature, in its newspapers, in its emigre culture, it is going on. The era is over, but it can still be tapped into, even if in this much tangential way. Thank you very much. I'm sorry it has to end on a sad note, but you knew the ending when we began, and that's where it has to go. I wish you the best of luck in the future.